what they did was to break an international agreement, the joint declaration, which was tabled at the UN, in order to screw any chance of the development in Hong Kong, or continuing development, of the sort of freedoms which they regard as a threat.
Now, the career of former Conservative Party chairman and Tory peer Boris Patten has taken him to some of the most high-powered offices at home and abroad. For 13 years, he was the Conservative MP for Bath before losing his seat in the 1992 election. He then became the 28th Governor of Hong Kong, an EU Commissioner, chairman of the BBC Trust, and is currently Chancellor of Oxford University. 25 years ago, the sun finally set on one of the British Empire's last holdouts. The UK returned Hong Kong, an imperial possession it held for more than 150 years, to China. Lord Patten became the final governor of Hong Kong between 1992 and 1997. During those tumultuous 5 years, he kept a diary describing in detail how Hong Kong was run as a British colony, what happened as the handover approached, and his efforts to secure political freedom for Hong Kong's institutions. The Hong Kong Diaries is a poignant account and a snapshot of history against the backdrop of Beijing's recent crackdown on freedoms in Hong Kong, embodied in the national security law introduced in the summer of 2020. Well, I'm delighted to say that Lord Patten joins us now on Times Radio. Good afternoon to you.
Hi, I'm delighted to be here too.
Chris, was the 25-year anniversary of Hong Kong being handed back to China, was that the only impetus for returning to your diaries from your time as governor?
It was part of the impetus, but I'd never kept a diary before. It's about, the original diary is about 4 times as long as what's been edited and printed here. I'd written about 900,000 words, I guess, during 5 years. Some I dictated at the end of a week, and some I wrote every day. That's, I think, rather a better way of doing it. But I just thought at the beginning of the lockdown, and there were all these cardboard boxes full of papers in my cellar, and my wife kept on telling me to do something about them. I was going to give them to the, and still will, to the Bodleian Library in Oxford. But she said, well, why don't you look at them first? And as I looked at them, I realized that I could edit them, keeping them absolutely accurate to what happened. And I thought they'd make quite a good story. So it's another example of the uses of adversity being quite attractive, as the Duke Senior says in As You Like It.
Another lockdown author.
To produce, rather than in the Forest of Arden, I did it in Barnes, SW13. And here it is. It took a long time, and I needed a greater knowledge of IT than I've got. I mean, I am to IT what Kim Jong-un is to nuclear weapons. I mean, I'm lethal with it. So I kept on needing advice from my wife, from my daughters, and even from my grandchildren. But that's an age thing, I guess.
Well, I'm glad to say that you've cracked it. My mum still phones me for advice. My dad just leaves it, quite simply, if he doesn't know what to do on the computer. Let's listen to, then, the historic moment that you handed power back over.
Now, Hong Kong people are to run Hong Kong. That is the promise, and that is the unshakable destiny.
25 years ago this week. How do you feel listening to that today, Chris?
Well, it was unshakable if you actually believe that you can trust the Chinese Communist Party. I don't mean Chinese people or China. I mean the Chinese Communist Party, which is very much a neo-totalitarian outfit. My biggest critic when I was governor of Hong Kong was a very distinguished, rather acerbic ambassador, rather vain ambassador called Percy Craddock, Sir Percy Craddock, of course. And he used to say, it was the core of his wisdom on China and negotiating about Hong Kong. He used to say, the leaders may be thuggish dictators, but they're men of their word. Well, we now know that at least part of that is true, but not both parts, because they're certainly not men of their word. And what they did, which scuppered what I was hoping for in 1997, what they did was to break an international agreement, the joint declaration, which was tabled at the UN, in order to screw any chance of the development in Hong Kong, or continuing development, of the sort of freedoms which they regard as a threat to their own control over China. and it's profoundly depressing. When Xi Jinping took over, you could say that until then, until 2012, 2013, things hadn't been going too badly for a bit. Some journalists had pointed out some of the things that weren't going well. There's a very brave female journalist now called Claudia Moe, married to a distinguished British writer called Philip Bowring, who wrote for British papers and international papers. And she used to warn against a gradual drift towards greater interference by China. But by and large, Hong Kong in 2011, 2012 was still discernibly the same place that it had been. Still a great free city, great international trading hub. And because Xi Jinping and his goons don't trust the freedoms you associate with an open society, don't trust 90-year-old cardinals or 80-year-old pro-democracy politicians, Hong Kong is being screwed and put into handcuffs.
Your diaries, I mean, there are 500 pages here, and it's very small print, so it will take a long time to get through them, but there's some fascinating detail in here. What were your greatest battles when it came to trying to negotiate the handover? And how many of those did you have to concede?
Well, the greatest battles had already, in some respects, been fought, because the Joint Declaration and the Basic Law only allowed for a limited progress towards greater democracy in Hong Kong. In the mid-1980s, the government, when it was negotiating with China the handover, because part of Hong Kong was only held on a lease for 99 years, so we couldn't hold on to it forever. When that was being negotiated, there were some people in Hong Kong who thought that there should be an arbitration clause in the treaty. But others, including the aforementioned Lord Percy Craddock, argued that that wasn't necessary because you could always trust the Chinese. Oh, yeah. And anyway, we were going to develop democracy. But we went pretty slow on that. When I became governor of Hong Kong, and I'm pleased to say that it's recognized by you and others that I was the governor of a colony of Hong Kong, because the Chinese now deny that was ever the case, that there was ever a colony. It was all occupied territory, they say, actually occupied by refugees from communism, but that's not the point. But when they were negotiating that with us, we had allowed for defense of human rights and civil liberties in Hong Kong, for the rule of law, and for some limited progress of democracy, and above all, that Hong Kong should have a high degree of local autonomy for 50 years after 1997. And that's been curtailed and doesn't any longer exist. I mean, Hong Kong is being turned into a sort of neo-police state by the communists.
Yeah, and so there was a big impact on democracy there. The country could never become independent. When you look at what's happening over there now in terms of how press freedoms are limited, how young people are being limited in the way that they go about their business, and the usual liberties that we are offered, certainly here in the West, when they are being denied, are there any regrets from your side, or anything that you think back to and you might say, well, I wish I'd thought ahead of this, or I feel I didn't warn enough about it? Or do you feel that for your part, you issued enough warning that this may happen, that China may do this?
I think we should have done a bit more, a bit earlier, about Hong Kong's development towards democracy. You have to put it in context, of course, because Hong Kong is pretty well the only colony that we weren't preparing for independence. Usually with our colonies, you put on the launching pad all the usual kit for an independent democratic state, bicameral legislature, free elections, judges in wigs and all that. And you lit the blue touch paper and fired it off, and hoped it would go into orbit. And sometimes it did, and sometimes it didn't. But that was never an option in Hong Kong, a point which the Chinese endlessly made. They said, if you start introducing democracy in Hong Kong, people in Hong Kong will think they're going to become independent one day, like Singapore or Malaysia. But that's not an option. So there were limits to what we could have done. But I think we could have done rather more in developing both democracy and in protecting civil liberties and human rights. I have to say, my own main regret when I look back on my 5 years is that I spent too long trying to negotiate a settlement with China when they were never going to provide one. I mean, for them, simply abusing us was more part of their game than negotiating any agreement. Lee Kuan Yew, with whom I often had disagreements, and he changed his mind on Hong Kong and China, said when I saw him before I became governor of Hong Kong, when I was on my way there, that what I should do was to without breaking the joint declaration and the basic law, which was Hong Kong's mini constitution based on that international treaty. Lee Kuan Yew said I should try to fill in the gaps, which is what I tried to do. I was attacked very often as I was sort of democratic Tom Paine, which was, alas, far from the truth. What I tried to do was to ensure that the elections were fair and clean, that more people could vote in them, and that some of the worst features of the existing system, like the rotten pocket boroughs which had been created, were got rid of. But I think the thing that most annoyed the Chinese was the Chinese communists, let me make that point clear again, was that I insisted on telling people in Hong Kong what we were going to do, rather than negotiating secretly with the Chinese communists and then imposing it on Hong Kong. And they hated the idea of Hong Kongers being involved in determining their own destiny.
Yeah, and they weren't at that negotiating table with you either. You describe Hong Kong in the book as a city you love. Describe your love affair with it. Well,
first of all, it has all the attractions of a lot of great port cities, like New York, if you like Sydney to some extent, and others. A very outward-looking sense of the place, the far horizons, ships coming in and out, and the population inevitably representing that international aspect, as well as representing in Hong Kong's case refugees from communism in China. Probably more than 2/3 of the population are themselves refugees from China or descendants of refugees from China. It also had a wonderful blend of, I thought, the best of the East and some of the best characteristics of the West, and which were brought together in a sort of instinctive understanding of the relationship between economic freedom and political freedom. There's a very good political scientist, an American, Sammy Feiner, who wrote three huge volumes in which he detailed all the different sorts of governments around the world. And he had a chapter on being liberal without being democratic. And the only society he could think of which was both open, liberal, full of the rule of law and the aspects of liberty you associate with that. But it didn't have full democracy. It should have done and would have had some time. But it was an extraordinary combination. And I like the fact that if you like food as much as I'm afraid I do. Hence
I was just about to say, what about the food?
Well, I know the food was fun. You've got the best of Asian. You've got the best of Chinese, North and South. You've got some of the best of Indian. And then there were others there were some great Italian restaurants in the place, French restaurants and so on. So it was a great place for wandering around. Whether I wrote one or two travel pieces about it, both then and after. Both ambling around the Hollywood Road, where all the best shops are for buying antiques, or the wonderful walking you can get still in the New Territories. Very, very a wonderful place, and great water. Great to be able to go out in a boat. It was just terrific. So it was hard work being mayor of Hong Kong in those conditions with the Chinese breathing down our necks. But nevertheless, it couldn't have been a lovelier place. And my whole family, I owe a great deal of credit to them, particularly my wife, who gave up a career to come with me.
I was just about to say this. She Lavender emerges really as the sort of unassuming hero of the diaries. I very much enjoyed reading about her part in it, also about your dogs, Whiskey and Soda, as well. There were a few entries regarding them. But tell me about Lavender. As you said, she left a legal career to come and be part of your support network in Hong Kong. But she wasn't just your support. She was very astute, wasn't she, in quietly going about her business for you.
She was particularly important in sustaining my morale from time to time, still is. She was also terrific because she was, as other governors' wives had sometimes been, she was head of lots of charities, particularly ones in areas that interested her, like hospice care, like dealing with AIDS patients, like disability, like homeless sleepers, all those sort of areas where she would work very often with some of the religious organizations, priests, nuns, and so on. She was very lively in all those areas and picked up a huge amount of what was going on. And she kept me very much informed about what we should be doing with the Vietnamese migrants who were in camps there. All sorts of other areas, family law. She was terribly good on what was happening socially in Hong Kong, and would. I remember when she was going to open a new Down syndrome facility for kids. Some of the neighbours, not all of them, but a few of them, were incensed that there should be a Down syndrome hospital or care facility in their neighbourhood. They thought it would affect the price of the value of their property, and they were threatening to throw bags of urine over her if she came, and she just said, "Well, I've never had that experience before," and went ahead, and of course nothing happened. But she was brave and gutsy, and as ever, very, very thoughtful. And still managed to play a mean game of tennis. She's a lefty, which is very unfair.
You say that she still it provides great morale boosting to you. She's still a great morale booster for you. What gets you down, Chris? Just out of interest.
Well, I'm preternaturally pessimistic. The other day during the Test match, one of my 11-year-old grandchildren was here watching the cricket. And just when Johnny Bairstow came in, he said, "What's going to happen, Grandpa?" And I said, "We're going to lose by a streak."
And how wrong you were,
said,
Chris Patten.
No, he said, it'll be all right. There's only 5 wickets down or 6 wickets down. And of course, Billy was right. He's been crowing ever since. So I do tend to look, if at all possible, at those parts of the glass that don't have anything in them. I'm pretty depressed by the state of the country at the moment, and by the state of the world. I mean, I look forward to days when one's discussions can be Boris-free zones, because I'm so fed up with talking about the leadership of the Conservative Party. I'll leave that to other people from now on.
Come on, Chris.
No, I'm depressed. Well, everybody knows my views. There's no point in me repeating them. What really depresses me is the thought that the democracies around the world, starting with America, which we need as a leader for the democratic world, are starting to lose faith in the core issues of democracy. To see the Republican Party, parts of it, behaving as though it was actually true that Biden hadn't won the election. To see parts of the Democratic Party, for example, on what are called woke issues, going in crazed directions, defunding the police, not believing in merit in education. Those things are depressing, because we can see off the Putins, we can see off post-peak China, which is what I think we're going to be facing in the next few years. But we've got to believe in ourselves in order to do that. The things we stand for in democracies are far more resilient, far more likely to survive than what these old totalitarians think, who need to be able to lock people up in order to stay in power.
Boris Johnson yesterday did an interview with CNN at the G7 summit, and he called the insurrection on the Capitol over in Washington on January the 6th last year. He called it weird. And Jake Tapper, the host, said to him, people died. It was more than weird. And Boris Johnson said again, it was weird. It looked strange from the outside. Of course, ripples have been caused over in the United States because it was a deadly insurrection. It
wasn't weird. I mean, it's not diplomatic to say something which your friends in other countries will think are, to use a phrase, weird. I think the way it's been covered in Congress, I think their hearings have been extraordinarily powerful.
But then why would Boris Johnson call it weird? He knows he's on American TV.
Because he wouldn't want to upset right-wing Republicans. And he
wouldn't want to upset Donald Trump?
Well, he might not want to upset Donald Trump, unlike most of the rest of the country. So I think when he said, who knows what his psychological thinking was in using that word, but I guess he was wanting not to cross Mitch McConnell and Ted Cruz and Rubio and all the others who are, I think, doing a huge amount of damage to democracy and their attitude. So I would hope that next time he had to think of an adjective to describe what would happen, it would be rather more apposite than weird.
I know that you don't want to talk about Boris Johnson. You've said clearly that everyone knows what you think about him. Just to fill our listeners in, you've said it would be a disaster if Boris Johnson wins the next election. What does the Conservative Party need to do here, Chris? You can sit from that very privileged position of being an onlooker but not being actively involved. You're a former Conservative Party chairman. Give the party some sage words of advice here.
Well, just to be accurate, I said it would be a disaster for those of us who want to retain the union, because I think that for the SNP, Boris is to a considerable extent the gift that goes on giving. And I think that we are going to need to fight Tories, Labour, Liberal Democrats together if we're going to prevent the breakup of the United Kingdom, which I think would be a disaster for us at home and abroad. But look, there's a letter by Edward Garnier, the former Conservative Attorney General, now in the House of Lords, this morning in the paper, saying if cabinet ministers won't move to ensure that there's a new prime minister, then perhaps ministers of state or parliamentary secretaries should. There are others who say, well, the 1922 committee need to look at their rules again about elections. There are others, William Hague and Michael Howard, who simply call for the Prime Minister to go. I mean, two leaders of the Conservative Party, far more distinguished in this debate than I am. And, you can say the same thing over and over again. But if people don't move, then he will be Prime Minister for 1 term, 2 terms, 3 terms.
Well, he wants 3 terms, doesn't he? That's what he said. Is it just Boris Johnson? Is Boris Johnson the only issue here, or is it those in the party who might be facilitating him?
I think it's both. I think, to be fair to some people who think we should let things lie at the moment, I was listening to David Davis this morning, who was more or less saying, look, you can't have an election every 5 minutes until you get the results you like. And that's quite a good argument. Nevertheless, when you look at the proportion of non-job-holding Conservative MPs who voted no confidence in him, much higher than the 40% of all MPs who voted with no confidence. But Boris is a curiosity. A contemporary of mine at Oxford, Martin Hammond, who's a brilliant classical scholar, went on to be headmaster of City of London School and Tunbridge School for a long time. He was Boris's housemaster and classics teacher at Eton, Lucky Boris. And he wrote a report to Boris's father when Boris was, I think, 16 or 17, which has been quoted over and over again. And you wonder who could have leaked the report. Maybe it was Boris's father. I don't know.
Stanley Johnson, maybe, yeah.
Anyway, it's not impossible. Martin had said that, I'm paraphrasing, but not much. He said that Boris thought it was churlish of other people not to understand that he was special, and that the network of obligations and responsibilities that the rest of us felt necessary to follow or to be bound by, Boris thought didn't apply to him. And I think that nobody has written better about him, and I think it's still true today. And if the Conservative Party is happy to go on putting up with that, Boris isn't going to change. I'll say that for him. And when he does something which I think is right, I'm prepared to say that. I think the line he's taken on Ukraine has been splendidly robust. I just wish, there's no criticism of him in particular, I just wish we had, as a society, as Europe, been more robust in defending Ukraine earlier, because they kept on applying for membership, and we kept on saying things. Indeed, I was obliged to say it by the Council of Ministers when I was a European Commissioner, that we recognise their European vocation, to which they would respond, what the hell does that mean? Instead of providing easier access to NATO, we should have provided easier access to the European Union. And the reasons why the big member states wouldn't do it, including us, was that we thought it would be too costly, because it's a big market economy. But they were far closer in many respects to the rest of us in Europe than some of the member states in Southeast Europe that we let in.
Chris, finally, you are currently Chancellor of Oxford University, and it would be remiss of me not to mention the debate about whether it's correct to enshrine people who hold a dubious history, a history that perhaps some argue shouldn't be celebrated. We'll take the example of Cecil Rhodes, the businessman and the politician, played a dominant role in southern Africa in the late 19th century, paving the way for apartheid by working to alter laws on voting and land ownership. His name, of course, adorns the Rhodes Building at Oxford, and there's a statue there too. There's been some debate about whether his name should remain and the statue should remain. Suggestions like they should turn the statue around so that Rhodes is facing away from people looking at him. Instead, the decision's been made to put an explanatory plaque there, contextualising his place in history. Was that the right move? Was that necessary?
Yeah, I think it was the right move. I mean, I've always taken the view that if using Rhodes's money to fund scholarships for kids from not only South Africa, but other parts.
Oh, we've lost you just very slightly, I think.
Africa. Then it was good enough for me. And Nelson Mandela and I stood on the same platform celebrating one of the anniversaries of the Rhodes Trust, which does some fantastic work. And people, first of all, hardly anybody would know where the Rhodes statue was if there hadn't been this controversy. It's high up in a building. I don't question the integrity or concern of people who express views about it, but we'll have different views, and we have to tolerate one another's views and actually try to work out what we're actually talking about. Our excellent Vice Chancellor, with whom I totally agree about this issue and about all freedom of speech issues, actually, we're on the same song sheet. When a group of students went to see her to complain about the Rhodes statue, she said, "What's the objection?" And they said, "Well, we shouldn't have a statue to a slave owner." And she said, "Well, he wasn't a slave owner. He was a businessman. He might have done things which nowadays, using contemporary moral standards, we wouldn't much care for." So they said, but he employed people at very low wages to go down mines. And she said to them, "How much do you think Welsh miners were paid in 1870? And it is important, I think, not always to view the past through today's prism. I have no doubt at all that we should, in considering British history, take account of the importance, the awful importance of the slave trade in the Atlantic economy. But there are other things which you have to look at as well, and you can't look at everything through that prism.
Okay.
We have to be fair about race. We have to make sure that its role in British politics is taken seriously. There's a guy who writes for your wonderful newspaper who's written a book called Empire Land, which I think has just about the right balance in these arguments. So we should take note of them. But I don't think that it's important. I think it's very important to do so on the basis of fact and evidence, and not sort of to make it up as you go along.
Satnam Sanghera is the author of Empire
He
Land.
is indeed.
And
It's
it
a
is a good
terrific
book.
book.
It is a good book. Thank you so much for your time with us. I've overrun horribly, but it's because it's been so fascinating. Lord Chris Patten, thank you for joining us. The Hong Kong Diaries is published by Alan Lane and it's out at the moment. Our thanks to Chris.